If you will go back to your learning materials section in the seventh module, you will see a link that's entitled Lessons from the Pattern. And if you'll click on that link right now, Lessons from the Pattern, you will see a PDF document that will look just like this. Simply one page, but it's an outline of what I'm going to share with you now, and I think it'll be helpful for you to follow that outline. There's lessons we can learn from the patterning between Genesis, the creation story, the flood story, the Exodus story. We've already noticed that God is consistent. His actions are consistent. You could say he's faithful to his promises. So the past actions set a pattern. Creation sets a pattern for the flood. Creation, the flood, set a pattern for the Exodus. There's going to be a pattern there because God is consistent. But second, God carries out much, but not all, of the pattern. To put it in another way, God is unpredictable. God is not bound to carry out every detail of the pattern. Third, God is not limited to previous patterns. He can do new things at times that become patterns for later actions. This dynamic of three that we mentioned earlier is also critical when it comes to Bible prophecy. Because in Bible prophecy, we sometimes expect that God must fulfill every single detail of the prophecy, or it's not a fulfillment. And that is not what you see in fulfilled prophecy in the Bible. That God seems to leave things open. The language used can allow God to go in a number of different directions depending on how circumstances play out and depending on how human beings respond. A fourth thing that we learn from the patterns of creation, flood, and Exodus is that God sometimes spiritualizes the type. In other words, he can take a literal event like the waters covering the earth, and that can become a metaphor for God's people being burdened under sin, or the Israelites being burdened under slavery. So God can take a literal historical event, and that can become a type of a spiritual condition or a spiritual action that God will do at a later time. So we see in this pattern the spiritualization of the type. And this becomes very important when we get to the New Testament, because some people will accuse the New Testament of distorting the Old, of going in some new direction, completely ripping up the old faith. That's not the attitude of the New Testament. The New Testament rewriters believed they were giving the real meaning of the Old Testament. And they could say that because they were reading the Old Testament typologically. In other words, seeing the literal actions of Israel and of God as setting models for spiritual realities that were being experienced in New Testament times and beyond. This is a very important principle. Number 5, it seems that as you go through all of these books, that Israel is constantly faithless and God is constantly faithful. And that's probably the story of the whole Old Testament. God is faithful, but Israel often is not. In fact, rarely is Israel faithful. So you have a dynamic of a God in relationship with a people that isn't listening most of the time, isn't performing most of the time, and perhaps you and I should feel very related to that. And then number 6, the present in each of these cases was described in the language of the past. God describes the Exodus through the pen of Moses in language reminiscent of creation and the flood. God uses the language of the past to describe what he is doing in the present. And we see that particularly strongly in the Exodus story. As the writers of the Bible describe God's activity in their experience, they do so by means of language associated with God's activity in the past. So here we see in 7a a foundation for Scripture. A foundation for salvation. Salvation is rooted in the human condition. It is because of the human condition that salvation is needed. You can describe that condition in a variety of ways. All of them have value. And then salvation is describing how God deals with the human situation and brings about a positive outcome. So as we move forward in our study, we're setting the foundation for a biblical theology of salvation. And the outcome, I suspect, will be in many ways a surprise to most of you. So thank you for paying attention to this particular lecture video. This is the conclusion of Module 7, letter A, in which we have been looking at the Pentateuch as a whole, setting a foundation for the rest of Scripture.